Good afternoon. I'm Ed Wasserman, and having met the panelists, I can assure you there'll be very little moderate about this panel. But I'll do my best. Can I ask you, starting on your stage right, would you introduce yourselves and
sure.
say who you are and what you do?
My name is Amit Bhattacharyya. I work at Vox Media. I'm the head of data science there, and I also teach machine learning in the MIDS program.
My name is Jeremy Rue, and I am an assistant dean at the Graduate School of Journalism. I teach in our multimedia program, which intersects a lot with coding and data, and studied computer science as an undergrad, went into journalism, worked in journalism, and been teaching for about 12 years now. So.
I'm Cheryl Phillips. I teach data journalism and investigative journalism at Stanford, and I also founded something called Big Local News, which collects local data and normalizes it, archives it, and sends it back out for better use. And we're hoping to use some machine learning in relation to some of that. So.
Hi, I'm T. Christian Miller. I go by T. It's a family nickname, so please call me T. I'm a reporter at ProPublica, and I'm a practitioner. Use data an awful lot in many of my stories, and I also teach data journalism here at the Berkeley's Journalism School.
Well, I'd like to start off with a big gnarly question. Journalism has always been conducted in the shadow of ethical obligations and ethical principles, whether it's respecting privacy, minimizing harm, seeking to tell the truth. And the big question I would ask to tee things up, and forgive me for that, but is, so what's changed? Why has data transformed, or has it transformed? Has it intensified conflicts and problems, ethical problems that journalists have always wrestled with? Has it introduced new problems? And what does it do with the prospects? How does it alter the landscape in a way that makes doing journalism ethically more or perhaps less difficult? So please have at it.
Am I starting? I'm
please
teeing
do.
It off? Okay. So I think the first part of your question is that data is more available than ever before, and the tools to analyze that data are also more open source, they're more available. And then finally, I think journalism as a profession is still coming around to understanding that we can do some of the kind of things today that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and approaching social science and some of the rigor that we apply to our stories when we're using data to collect information. Now, the ethical problems, I think, as with any new technology, has introduced new ethical issues. And just a quick example, so a couple years ago, ProPublica did a story that essentially we got every single prescribing doctor in the country, and we measured what their opioid prescription rate was, right? And that was kind of a story to look at opioid prescribers who had prescribed too much. We started noticing a strange pattern, and we published that data so you could see who were the big prescribers of opiate drugs in America. We started seeing this weird pattern of hits on this database, and what it turns out is that our data set was used by opioid users to find those doctors who prescribed the most opiates. And that was the primary use of that data set, was to go find more doctors where I could get cheap drugs from. Totally unexpected circumstance, was not something we planned on ever happening, but it is one of those things which an unintended consequence of publishing this data was that we had opened the taps to opioid abusers throughout America.
So how does that alter the ethical determination of whether the story is worth doing?
It doesn't alter the ethical determination, in our case, so much about the story itself, but on how we present that story. So do we liberate this data? Do we make it available for the average user? Another example is we also did a story looking at doctors who did a handful of surgeries, and which of those doctors had higher complication rates than otherwise you would expect, right? In a typical story, if I'm doing a story about a doctor who gets a bad rating, I, as a journalist, my first order of a requirement is to call the doctor and say, hey, you got a really bad rating, tell us why that is, what might explain this. When you have 100,000 doctors and some of them have C ratings or below average ratings, how do I call? I can't call all those doctors. But yet you would argue this is based on data, I think it was CMS data, done by Medicare. And so it was direct from the government. We analyzed what the government's data was. But
all data is dirty data.
All data is dirty data. So how were we able to kind of check and call those doctors and say it wasn't maybe it was miskeyed data, but there might be some reason behind it. And so that is something we struggle with in publishing that data. Is we eventually set it on putting a little check mark, which said, like, if you think this is wrong, check it here, and we'll contact you. But is that a satisfactory solution if it's already been sitting out there for a couple of weeks?
I do think that's one of the real complications with this is that, I mean, back in 1968 when Phil Meyer did social science analysis of the riots in Detroit, you know, he had to go hire machine time and in a computer that was the size of a room and go at night, and like nobody, like his data was just not out there for anybody to find. It's much more ubiquitous now than it used to be. And if I'm looking at data, so for example, we used open policing data at Stanford. We had Texas, for Texas, we had every traffic stop in the state by the state patrol. That data actually comes with the address of the driver attached. That is a public record. Now, when we released that data, did we release that level of data? No, because.
So talk about that. When should publicly available data not be made public?
Yeah, so in this particular case, we released the stop level data with the time, the date, race, all of that stuff. And then if a researcher or a journalist wants to use that data for journalistic purpose and they promise not to just post it up on the internet, for anybody to go peruse somebody's personal address when they're not a public official, they can come to us and we'll release it to them. It's just that we didn't want it to be just put out there kind of willy-nilly. So we wanted to treat it responsibly.
So perhaps one of you can talk about the question of gun permits. That's been a real hot button issue, right? So what?
That changed the law. Was it New York or New Jersey?
In Virginia. Oh, New Jersey.
Well, there were a number of publications.
Yeah.
The Roanoke Times in Virginia did it. The Cleveland Plain Dealer did it. They got hold, if you're not following this, as I recall, and correct me if I'm wrong, they found out that it was carry permits. It was people who had carry permits, not just ownership, because a lot of times you don't need a permit to have a gun in your nightstand or you know, in your kid's bedroom, wherever you want to keep your guns. But these were people who had concealed weapons permits. And these were publicly available. You have to pass a certain standard of, well, maybe there's some application process.
Money to the local sheriff.
Data, right? Yeah.
Right. Okay, so these papers decided, well, we'll just run all the names. So then what happened?
There was one paper in particular, it was either New York or New Jersey, and they published a map of all of the permits. And so basically you were telling the world, hey, these people have a gun in their house, essentially. And the reaction was so quick that basically the state legislature passed a law and said this is no longer public record because they considered it an invasion of privacy.
I think if you talk to most journalists, we definitely align with a lot of privacy advocates, but on the flip side, we're often advocating for more open records. And so this is an issue that's, I think, been in journalism for a long time. I think we think about this in terms of ethics because it's only because of open access and open records that we're able to ferret out corruption. We're able to find out if politicians are doing deals on the side. I mean, a lot of amazing investigative journalism is only made possible through public access and public records. And so on one side, we're definitely advocates for better access of records. But I think, and it's complicated, the issue, because there's so many new entrants in this area of journalism that now are trying to exploit public records, for profit motivation. There's sites now that show mugshots and criminal records, and you can search your name on Spokeo or something, and it'll just tell you everything about yourself. And so it's a worrying time because journalists, at least we had this professional obligation, this thinking behind our ethical obligations to consumers of what do we, even though, like you said, it is technically public, but the friction that was required to actually access it, to make a request, and to receive the records, just simply making it more accessible, I think was enough to certainly.
Well, and if I could go back, can I tell you one thing about this? So
sure.
Texas, going back to Texas for a second, KXAN in Texas broke a huge story about that same driver data because they actually found, using that address level information, that basically the State Patrol was stopping black drivers but listing them as white. So that they were making it look like their stop rates were much better when it came to stopping minorities than they were, and they were able to prove that out by mapping out the data, saying this is a predominantly minority neighborhood. Let's go check and see if this person's really white or black. And in fact, they were, and they used the census surname database. They used all kinds of things to show, but their story showed all these driver's license pictures of the guy, or the woman, and they were black, and the ticket lists them as white.
Amit, I'd like to bring you in because I'm curious. That it was referenced. Jeremy had reference to the way different institutions interpret the values that are supposed to govern the conduct, the practice of journalism. You're at Vox. Vox has a reputation of being a bit more on the swaggering side, a bit more adventurous, and it has a very loyal, does terrific stuff, has a loyal viewership. And I'm wondering, you probably are familiar with or have worked at other news organizations. Have you noticed differences in the way these values, the way ethical obligations are being defined with respect to data use?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't do a ton of 538 style data journalism, but definitely I get a lot of requests, internally, like, hey, we have these numbers, can you help us interpret them? We have these numbers, can you help make sense of them? We're working on this story, is it okay to say this, is it okay to say that? And I think, sort of as these students are going through the data science program, it helps to kind of remember that, you can interpret. There's lots of different ways, models you could use, and you could probably come up with very opposing conclusions based on sort of what you want to say, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I see happen the most is that, usually the journalist has something in mind as they're dealing with the data, right? So you have a thesis, and then the data you think is going to back up that thesis, and it usually ends up happening that way, right? But you have some choices, and I think that's the tricky part is like when your data is not necessarily backing it up, then do you still proceed with that argument or not? It's a little tricky. The one thing you had sort of asked like initially to start off that like what's changed? One thing is of course like the availability and the tools, but also maybe there's something's changed in the way people consume news, right? They want more data-backed news. For example, I've been telling my wife, like, oh, I love broccoli. We should eat it more often. It's healthy. But, okay, fine. But now there's an article that says, data says broccoli is healthy. She's like, we should eat broccoli. Right? So, but yeah, so there's something
that's a good thing.
Right, yeah.
But broccoli, not so much. But
Yeah.
Broccoli farmers?
Yeah. But something has changed, it seems, in that people want that sort of validation from the data before they're ready to believe something as readily.
And I think one of the challenges in journalism is, you're absolutely right, but is this having this data literacy among reporters, because data has an incredibly persuasive effect on articles, and there's been studies that show just the mere existence of a chart, adds the veracity that people interpret and
Unless
perceive.
it's a pie chart.
Unless it's among the general public, even the pie chart might have a persuasive effect. And entities have learned this very quickly. You see politicians and ads and advertising. A lot of people start throwing statistics and charts and data around, and it's a powerful tool, and reporters can easily misuse it as well. So I think.
Well, Cheryl, you had made a point earlier in our email exchanges about the adequacy of training that journalists are getting to use data, to harvest it, to confront it. You want to talk a little about that?
Well, yeah, it's not adequate. It's not adequate anywhere, really. There are some universities that teach it, which is great. She teaches it here. But by and large, it's not taught far enough. And it's also, when you go into a newsroom, it tends to be siloed. So there might be a couple of people or a few people who use data journalism, anything like, maybe more who understand how to use Excel, but far fewer who might use a programming language. And then they're trying to tackle things like AI and understanding machine learning models or things like that, or looking at pretrial algorithms. How are you going to be able to cover that if you don't even understand how a model is built?
Right. I think that is another risk very much, is that when I talk about the tools, 20 years ago, you couldn't do a linear regression model, right? Now I've got R for free. I type RLM, parentheses, boom, I'm done. I've got a cool correlation. It works. I'm going to publish, right? Now, and it's true that journalists we don't hold ourselves out to be social scientists, so maybe the bar is a little lower. But I would still say that there is a huge gap in understanding statistics fundamentals. Now, I will also say I think that actually does apply to academics more than likes to be admitted in the field. There's a lot of academics who are writing and using statistical models that don't really know what's going on as well. But it certainly is a risk that now today I can do a correlation on just about any two variables that I get in any junky data set and show something and not really have to worry that much about I got science behind me, I got statistics behind me, I'm done.
What do you? Could I ask you a question?
You
Just
bet.
in the sort of like conversation nature. So there's also like this whole internet of pseudo-journalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yes.
anybody can just get up there and write a blog post. It goes on to Medium, and
Now
it
they're
shows
journalists.
up in your feed, and and people think that's news and journalism as well. And maybe someone's using data or not to like make a point, badly or not. I just want to know from your perspective as like real journalists, what is that? That's clearly part of the landscape nowadays.
I think there was more, I could be wrong, I think there was more concern about the credibility of that kind of writing, that kind of work a few years ago. And I think one of the perhaps unexpected discoveries of the last few years, notwithstanding all this surge of fallacious and self-serving and manipulative content, that people are able to distinguish. There are distinctions made, and there seems to be a flight to quality in terms of when people are looking for accounts that they know they can trust, they're going to go to certain brands that they've trusted in the past. And people might go to Fox News because the commentary, because they like its incendiary commentary and it reflects their views, but they don't necessarily mistake that for an alternative conception of reality. I submit. So I don't think it's quite some of the intense concern we had a few years ago with this flood of bad information that would actually create these seriously alternative universes of fact may not be quite as, may not have really come about in the way we feared. You may disagree, but I think that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah, journalism has always been enjoyed. It's license free, right? You need a license to teach, to practice law, to practice medicine, to give massages. You have to have a license. No, there's no license for journalism, and it's because of that some of the best journalism throughout the decades has been done by the fringes. And so it's but in the marketplace of content, I mean, that's why I think the onus is that on us to build reputation, to build recognition, to establish ourselves. And it's tricky. It's not a perfect solution. And I know there's probably a lot of people saying, no, it needs to be regulated more, but it's very much like free speech itself.
And actually one of the positive developments is because a lot of the programming languages are now open source, it's not like I have to go use my licensed piece of software to analyze something. Right. I can put my code up. I can make it transparent. I can be like, here is the story that we did, and here is all of the code that is commented that tells you how we did our analysis. So if you take issue with it, here you go. Tell me exactly what you take issue with. And that helps, I think, toward your point.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. It's like, I think what the answer is one, transparency. So, publishing your method just as you would in a scientific paper. It's now there's no kind of restrictions on space, so you can do that. But it's also about educating our audience in terms of things that we have done naturally. Like a quick example is normally in what we do, we'll have 3 or 4 sources that we've talked to for every source in the article, right? Or we'll have done 10 different runs or 50 different runs on a set of data before we publish the final data. We've always kind of expected and assumed that readers know we put that much effort into a story, but now it's kind of it is upon us and critical upon us to draw that distinction out and make it public to create that comparison between something that's on Breitbart.com and quotes a couple of statistics from climate change and a more reputable organization and when the work they have done. So I don't think you can tackle the problem in a regulatory way. I think you have to tackle the problem in an education way.
I'm changing the subject a little bit here because there was an article a first-person article that I use in my ethics class from a woman who was leaving journalism. And the reason she was leaving, she worked at a small paper somewhere in the heartland. She was tired of writing petty crime stories. And she didn't want to write any more stories about drunk driving or, didn't matter what it was, because the harm that was done by those stories was so grossly disproportionate to their news value or their public illumination value. Because those stories they were universally available, right? Universally accessible, and they were imperishable. So whoever was vilified or whoever reflected badly, and maybe it's a goofy story about somebody doing something foolish, that person is going to, that story is going to come up first in the Google search results when you put in that person's name, and that person is going to struggle with that. So the time is gone when you could do something stupid, you got busted, whatever, and had some confidence that nobody would know about it unless they already knew about it and went to the county courthouse and pulled the arrest records and learned about it, or went to the morgue where the clips used to be kept of a paper newspaper. You had to go through the file and find it. That certainty is gone. And so you have this, and here you have a case where the news organization were doing what they've always done. They've always run embarrassing things about people. That's kind of part of the definition of news. And yet suddenly it was life-changing for the people involved. And so I wonder, are we looking at, does morality demand us to re-privatize certain public information? Do we observe different, and we cringe at that idea.
There's been so it's interesting. When I worked at the Seattle Times, a lot of newsrooms do this. We had a fund for the needy at Christmas time, where we would raise a lot of, we would write these stories about people who were getting help from different charities. There were like a dozen charities that we supported. We raised money for, and so we would write stories about the people whose lives had been turned around because they'd gotten the help from the charity. And yet, if we write a story about how they had struggled, right, and then it went out there, and then maybe they couldn't get a job because we wrote a story about how they had been homeless or on drugs or something, had been convicted of something, and they're like, but that was me then, and that's not me now, and I get it, you want to try to raise money to give to this, it was such a conundrum. And it affected the way that we worked about what was going to be on the record, what was going to be quoted, and did the person really know the risks?
So are you sympathizing with the right to be forgotten?
Depends, I think. I think it's I think it's
I don't know how, maybe you
it's
should
more like
explain
the right to know. It's like let's say that I'm talking to somebody who is not used to dealing with a journalist, and I want them to talk to me on the record. It's on me to say to them, you need to understand the risks. If you talk to me, you could get fired. You could not get a job in the future. This is going to follow you around. And yes, here's the benefit that's going to come out of the journalism that we think will happen. But you need to know all of that landscape, and then you need to make an informed decision. And I think that is more on journalists now than ever before.
And can I say too, I think the reporter's attitude there is actually kind of backwards looking. Because if you look forward, if what we're reporting is that a lot of people have shit in their lives, then that's the truth, right? And forward-looking, like shame is a harmful and mostly middle-class emotion. So as we push forward and we kind of all get to know that we all have fucking problems and shadows in our background, doesn't that make us better, a more sympathetic, overarching society? So we're not having to hide problems and hide shit that we have.
You actually see a more forgiving society out there?
I see that as we go forward, all of us learn that we've got a DUI in our background somewhere, our friends are trans, or one of our friends, something hidden in the past. Like, let's open that up. And yes, there's a painful transition period where we're all learning about each other's warts and ugly things, but eventually that takes us past a very harmful action to hide shameful things as though they are shameful. And I would say long term that the truth that we all have kind of shadows ends up being a liberating thing, and but that is kind of part of the long-term practice of journalism.
There's another thing that I think about a lot, and I don't think this conversation happens enough in journalism. Maybe it happens more in the data science world, but it's this idea, this observer effect, this stereotype threat that Claude Steele used. So basically, the data describes the world as it exists in some fashion, and how much of that might actually be self-fulfilling, or it might actually imbue. So if we look at race data, we look at education data and say, things are kind of screwed up, and that can have a demoralizing effect. It can influence people the same way that we're making statements just about how things are, that it might actually fulfill people or permeate people's thinking in terms of how things should be versus kind of pointing out the problems. And we don't talk about what the implications are of releasing data in that sense, of what kind of statements we're making when we say, I'll give an example. One of the data sets we play around when we're learning Excel at the grad school is education data and the way standardized test scores correlates with economic abilities. And it's just this perfect kind of, you take any kind of school district, here's the percentage of students that are receiving free lunches within a school district, which you have to have certain income requirements, and here's how well they do on the test scores, and the perfectly matched line, in most cases. And this, I could see it in the students. They're like, boy, if you're poor, you have no chance. That's it, you're screwed. And there's no way of getting out of it. And it's an awful feeling. But there are outliers. And this is one of the things that we try to train our students. This isn't a description. This isn't 100%. And understanding probabilities, and it gets a little bit into AI and machine learning, but that, it's we're not very rational when we think about statistics and probabilities, and I think that kind of literacy is important for journalists to have.
I think at Vox we collect a lot of data. People are clicking around on the website and any other information that they choose to give us, and as you go through and do data science, like you were saying, and you build these models based on people's behavior, you can only quantify people's behavior. You can't project forward of like a better state or a wishful thinking state of how to make it better. You can show what the possibilities are. You can bucket people into, whatever buckets that you're bucketing into. It's challenging because it's human behavior data. At best, you can attempt to describe it, and your model can say like this bucket or that bucket or this cluster or that cluster.
So are there things going on at Vox that you see and you feel are kind of pushing up against the boundaries of the permissible when it comes to use of information?
I think it's always tricky like that because, for example, if I'm testing an algorithm and, I want to, recommend a new article that you should read based on the one you're currently reading, and I'm testing it out at the very beginning and I don't really know if it's working or not. So usually what I do is I find like some unique identifier that is for myself. But I also know that because I'm like a subscriber to some part of Vox, my email is in there and they have my name, and so I can find myself. Probably I could find the rest of you guys too. I don't, but I know how to find myself because that's the only way for me to kind of like quickly test, like I know what my preferences are on Vox and I know what my preferences are for food recommendations on Eater and all this kind of stuff. So I can kind of quickly get a reality check as to whether my model is like performing better or worse. And it's great to be able to do it where you kind of like know the right answer. But yeah, you're always kind of faced with those kind of, the data's in there, you can kind of like have access to it if you want, but it's not really necessary at a global level. Like when any one of you come to Vox and you're reading an article, like I don't care who you are. Like the company really doesn't care, they just want you to read articles, watch more ads.
Yeah, hang on.
But yeah, there's definitely not quite a trade-off, but there's always that kind of temptation to like look if there was some reason to.
Let me take this down a slightly different path. I submit that one of the things that distinguishes journalism is that journalists honor a certain set of constraints on the ways in which they gather information, right? And we accept, for example, that we don't misrepresent who we are, right? We don't listen through keyholes, by and large. We kind of try to inform people. We tell people that we're reporters. We inform people to the degree that we can, with some limits of discretion. We try to inform people what the story is about, what it's going to be used for, what we're hoping to see. So there's a set of, you're trying to respect the autonomy of your source and respect the consent and to seek informed consent from the people you're getting information from. But increasingly, we are embedded in organizations whose business model is anything but getting informed consent. It's based on informational pillage. It's based on harvesting information to use for inferences in order to sell for marketing purposes, in which the people who are availing themselves of what we write don't really fully understand. Now, this group obviously knows a lot about this, but most of the people out there aren't really aware of just how thoroughly their activities and their preferences are being identified and flagged and sold. And if they knew, it's like who wants to be followed down the street and have your eyeballs tracked as to everything you look at in the shop window and then recorded and sold to somebody else, and that's kind of creepy. So isn't it kind of, I mean, how do you reconcile the incredible diffidence and respect that we're supposed to show when we gather information as reporters with the fact that our paychecks increasingly are coming from people who systematically ignore just those restraints?
Well,
That's
go ahead.
Amit gets that one.
No, that's a tricky one because, some sites have a paywall, some other ones, are paid for by advertising. The one thing that we've noticed, though, is, this harvested information that's like collected, sold, et cetera, like it's a pretty low quality information as well. As much as is being collected about you, when I go use it for an algorithm, it's very fuzzy. Like sometimes you'll get the same person will be classified as a man and a woman. It'll say you're a Giants fan and an A's fan both. Those things are probably not true, right? But it's just the quality of this. There's just a lot of data being collected, but the kind of insights and determinations that are being made from it are very kind of low quality and poor quality. And so when we're looking to do stuff at Vox of high quality and high caliber recommendations, we use only the data that we have on our own sites. Because if it's stuff that we're getting from third parties, this repackaged, resold stuff, it almost it's like the extra variables in your model that just make stuff worse. Right? We talked about just in the last talk about the importance of variables. Those extra pieces of noise just make it more noisy. And yes, it's a ton of extra data that you could look at and you think there might be some usefulness there. But in terms of getting a clean signal, the best thing for us is always to just, you came to Vox and we know you clicked around on a bunch of stuff, even if, they tell us your Facebook profile or they tell us, what other stuff you're supposedly in the market for buying a car. Those are these really vague, fuzzy determinations by these third parties, and we haven't found those to be particularly solid inferences out there. So I think for us, we're finding that all this data is just more noisy, and you have to kind of do more cleaner work to get good results.
Go ahead.
And I would push back a little on if the information pillagers. I'm pretty sure the marketing departments wouldn't like that term. But all that being said, I mean, in light partially because of the EU privacy decision, you are broadcast now. Do you take cookies or not take cookies? You are given some. I mean, I know it's nobody reads these, but you are always given a terms of service thing. Is that much different than a reporter calling up at 2 a.m. and saying, "Hey, your mom just died in a DUI accident. How do you feel?" Which is something that the young reporter, I'm sure, has done many times. You are just calling up saying, "I'm a reporter."
No, you knock on the front door. Come on.
Or you call or whatever, you're on a deadline, right? But I'm just saying that is
Sure.
that much different than me posting a very big, long, formal notice that's a terms of service, which says if you access this website.
Completely different. One is comprehensible, the other's not.
Wow, all right. I think that's,
One thing
if I can read through, I don't really know what this guy is calling me on the phone about, but I can read this out. So I don't know if it's quite so different as you're pausing it to be.
One thing I have noticed is, when I worked in newspapers, we didn't really think much about the singular stories, the constituent parts that went into the whole package. There was good weeks, there was bad weeks. I see in our alums now, the data, the analytics information has a very tangible influence on the way they perceive news judgment and newsworthiness. They're being judged, even at very respectable institutions, on how well their individual stories do, separate from how well the organization might be doing as a
The
whole.
metrics for measuring how well an individual story does are not great metrics. I mean, generally speaking.
It does.
Yeah.
Do you see new norms arising in response to some of the challenges we're talking about? Are institutions recognizing these problems and coming up with different guidelines, different rules? Are the ethics of journalism changing now?
Well, so I would say that so at ProPublica, it's very much been a work in progress. So that now we have, and ProPublica is a weird beast, right? We're not a daily news organization. So I want to kind of put us into the area of like, we have lots of time to do this. But we now have 3 statisticians that we contract out with at different universities, and they back read all of our data analysis. And then any data analysis that I do gets done a second time by a person in our shop. Completely, they rerun all my code and everything else to make sure that they agree with the decisions too. And then we have this outside influence. And then we publish a white paper which kind of explains exactly how we did it, which sometimes those are like 40 and 50-page long, literally papers explaining the methodology that went into obtaining, analyzing, cleaning, and the data that we have. So we are definitely constantly aware of it. We are changing our practices, like putting little arrows so that you can alert us to errors in your public database. I don't know how widely those are spreading as norms, but I know that it's very much with our practice, we are internally creating norms about how, much more formal norms about how you create and analyze data.
Here's where I think there's a challenge, is that in larger news organizations, you'll have more than one data journalist who they can backstop each other. I can analyze your work, you can analyze my work. But if I'm working in a newsroom that I'm the only data journalist, then I have to go through other measures to make sure that somebody is going to look at my analysis. And there have been issues with that, where a local journalist might end up making errors. I think you know of one probably. So where it was just somebody who might still be relatively new in the field of data journalism, and they made errors and they didn't have somebody to backstop them. And so those are those kinds of things where I think that's a real challenge, because it's often one person in a newsroom, and if it's an investigative piece, who are they going to call and say, hey, would you read this thing that we don't want anybody to know about until Sunday? Like, you have to really kind of navigate that.
And is there an advice line or a helpline available to journalists?
I think they could probably call IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors, and probably have them run it by. They could go to us at Big Local News, and we have backstopped some analysis work. All of our open policing stuff, we will look at their people's analysis before they publish it.
And I will say there's an interesting, at least what I've observed, there's an interesting cultural difference between data journalists who are kind of specialized data journalists only, and regular journalists who are, you have come up through it without a data background. Journalists in general are lone wolves. We often operate by ourselves when we're going out in the street and interviewing people, versus data journalists are much more collaborative, both amongst each other internally, because like there are huge battles internally between the Bob Woodwards and his sources and Bernstein and his sources, and they don't cross, they don't want to reveal each other's sources to each other because it takes a long time to develop a good source, right? So, but the data journalists both work internally much more in concert, and also externally in a way which I would never call up a New York Times reporter and say, hey, I'm working on this story, could you help me out? Because of the competitive thing. Whereas data journalists, because the process of coding is often collaborative, do not have that same hesitancy to kind of reach out. So I think there is help available out there, but
there's a really funny thing. So there's a listserv for data journalists. It's the NICAR listserv, and it's really funny because if somebody's working on something that's private, they'll post like, okay, I have 3 vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, and they'll list they'll just put out their problem, but rename everything to vegetables or something, and it's quite funny to watch. Yeah. But
there's a lot of questions with some of the leaks, and data that have happened. The Sony leak, the DNC emails leak, and a lot of journalists on the NICAR listserv even were, what's that, with the one website with the people, the infidelity website, I forget, where there was a leak of all these people. Madison.
Oh, right.
And journalists were saying, well, you should start cross-checking, our politicians with this data set. Let's see if any of them exist. And there's a, and there was ethical questions that were being raised. It was like, wait a minute, you could really destroy someone's life. And then other people did say, well, they deserve it, And
they're public officials too,
yeah,
right?
and they're public officials. Do they, everything they do is, and so it's really, and I think that's going to happen more, as in digital security. I mean, it's now weaponized as a mechanism for, hacking someone and releasing the information, as we've seen in the, an election. And I think it's just, that's going to become more frequent, and journalists are going to be challenged with, this question of whether or not they play a role in that. And so,
well, and in the speed at which something is published versus do you hang back and figure out what are the motivations for the release of this information, which we've seen lots of about
norms,
that.
new norms.
Yeah, I think like sort of, especially what you said, and then given that there's cybersecurity students here, I think that is going to be more and more an issue as to, going forward. Like, will people also be conscious of, fraud or hacks and all that kind of stuff? And because honestly, like at Vox, like we have secure servers and that kind of stuff, but it's not particularly high security. I used to work in, banks and stuff, and they're like the level of security is much, much higher, and even then you hear, there's like security breaches and stuff like that. And then I know a lot of people, especially in healthcare, there's so much personal information that you have to kind of worry about getting out. Yeah, and I think, a lot of people, like there's a lot of data, like journalism and data around healthcare, and people are always like, talking about all sorts of issues in healthcare, but it's tricky because the information could be traced back to like personal information.
Right. I mean, the surge of Espionage Act prosecutions of whistleblowers and sources, which started with George W. Bush and went through Obama, and still going on now, every one of those sources was identified without the prosecutors and law enforcement having to go to the reporters. Mm-hmm. And traditionally, the defense for the whistleblower was that the reporter is not going to give up the name if the reporter made a pledge of confidentiality. And so, and there was a lot of jurisprudence about that. It's not ever been codified, but as a practical matter, prosecutors would not send reporters to jail to get them to give up sources, for the most part. But now they don't have to. So the question is, because they get it, they hack it, or they wiretap, or they find other ways to get those names. And the question is, well, who's going to protect the sources now? Because the media organizations don't care as long as you leave all reporters alone.
Well, and are journalists going to be careful in the way in what they do with information? So, like, let's say you get a document and there's a telltale trace.
Well, right, and you'll tell them about that case, the Reality Winner case.
Right, exactly.
Which happened with The Intercept, because this was a case where it was the source, who I don't remember which agency she worked for, NSA?
No.
Well, she sent a photocopy that she'd made it work to reporters, and the reporters, to try to authenticate the document, shared it with the feds, and the feds recognized the telltale on the document and got her, and they nailed her in about 45 seconds.
Yeah, they also put it up on Document Cloud, so published the original document up in a way that anybody could take a look at it.
So here, I think one of the answers to your question, here's where the market solution will actually work. Those organizations which are more committed to protecting your privacy and protecting your data are going to attract the whistleblowers who seek privacy and data. And so the market will solve this particular problem. If you do not protect your sources and you let people be exposed, you're not going to get tips. And the market will.
It's a pretty small market.
Yeah, the Intercept is a weird thing, because the Intercept is precisely based on, it's a national security website out of New York, and it's precisely based on their security issues, and they've exposed 3 sources in their very short lifetime, which most newspapers go through their entire years of not exposing a source. So I think the market will speak, and you will go toward where you feel your data or your information is most safe. And if you do not have that, you will be shut out of those news scoops and those issues.
Sure, I would push just a little bit, just because I think that whole system is to create a chill effect, to prevent people from coming to journalists. And you're absolutely right. But journalists, I think, need to think more. I mean, I've talked to a lot of journalists that about digital security, and it just feels so out there, just like, it's just that feels like tinfoil hat. But I think having a literacy in what's needed to protect a source is at least a baseline understanding could be useful, because it's very. I mean, I'm surprised how few whistleblowers actually come forward on a lot of issues these days, and
they're going to jail.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the climate for whistleblowers. Dan Ellsberg didn't do one night in jail, and Chelsea Manning has already done 7 years, and the ferocious assault on people who leak secret documents is nothing we've seen before in this country.
That's very true.
Do we take questions from the floor? What's the protocol here?
We've got about 10 minutes, so be happy to take questions. Yes.
Okay. Do they have microphone? Oh, good. So yes, please. A woman here. Sorry. Yes, you.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. My question is, how can you validate open source data when you think it's flawed? So for example, when I was looking at a FARS government data, which tells you how many accidents, all of the intersection accidents with non-insured motorists leads to at least one death. And for my gut feeling tells me that's not quite right.
I would hope so.
Yeah, so, I mean, the minimum is if something looks alarming in data, it's probably an error, basically. So, I mean, I think it's, yeah, you have to figure out, like, what data do you have? Is it complete, or do you have a lot of missing data? I mean, all of the basic things that you do to kind of like look at the shape of the data, look for patterns that might indicate you have flawed data, you have a lot of misspellings, you have a lot of inconsistencies, things like that. All of that stuff has to be done at the very outset. And only
all data is dirty should be fundamental.
Yeah,
right?
all data is dirty data. I mean, that's just,
Yeah,
that's
the fundamental. If you're getting something from the government, your first thought is, I've got something from the government. It's filthy data, but perhaps I can find something useful in it after I put in hours and hours of cleaning it and getting it up to shape.
I'm working with assessor data right now for a particular county, and there are, we just found out this week, out of like, this was sales data, 100 and some thousand records, 100, maybe 150,000 records. There was one particular field that like the number of the value of the sale was didn't make sense. So we go back to them and they're like, oh yeah, that's a glitch. I'm like, what? Can you define glitch for us?
Question. Yes, sir, in the middle there.
So in data science, we often start with the data as the main character, and then the narrative is sort of supporting cast, and we try to sway the business side of an opinion or what we believe to be truth. In journalism, I see the narrative is the center, and the data is like the supporting character, but you still try to do the same thing. You try to present your version of the truth or what you believe to be the truth. And it seems the journalism way is more effective at convincing people. I mean, how can you share some tips of how you use data to, convince people of what you see the inside of the truth to be?
So I'll take that one. I think your observation is very astute and very accurate. Is that I see that as kind of the central difference too between academic side and journalism side, is that the narrative is kind of takes on the most important role for us in bringing to life people and characters. And this is a kind of a cliche in journalism, but our belief, and I think it's true, is that people identify with people, and people identify with human stories. And so we put in data as it supports or backs up what it is that we have found in the field, or we'll do the data analysis and we'll go out and find the people who kind of can help illuminate those trends. But we're always kind of, the story is the most atomic unit of journalism, is we are thinking about that atomic unit as a way we can use narrative and then fill it in with data. So I just did a project on some Navy warships, some destroyers, which crashed in the Sea of Japan a couple of years ago. There's not a piece of that says data was used in this. But if you look, we have shipping maps that show how crowded the shipping areas were around these Navy destroyers that hit cargo ships. We have data which shows the number of ships that were certified to be approved and go out, but that's all just hidden in the story. There's nothing that sort of calls out and says, and in a ProPublica analysis of 10,000 years of shipping data, we found this.
And frankly, it depends on the story. You might find stories like that says we analyzed X amount of data for this over this period of time, and then you might have other ones that are more character driven. And the other thing that I think you can see that happens is that so I'm thinking about the prescription methadone project that Mike Behrens did, right? So he had death records for Washington State, and he looked for people who had died because of a prescription methadone, so like for chronic pain, overdose, and he used the death records to find the people that he then wrote about. So he could find the people who died, so that he could find their families, so he could find the interviews that would build the character, that would tell the narrative story, but it was all rooted in data.
We run into this a lot when students are doing like basic like science stories. Sometimes they write for their sources. They want to sound smart. They put up as much technical jargon in the story, and making a story accessible to the layperson, making it easy to understand and simplify it, keeping a lot of stuff on the cutting room floors, like we like to say, like filming. You want it to be as accessible as possible, and we do that through humanizing it, through characters, so people find it relatable. They can picture themselves in that situation. They can see and try to really paint a very visual picture in their mind of what this reality is that's being described to them. And so.
No, I would. It was a great distinction you made between like journalism and data science, but I would encourage all of you guys to think of yourselves as that journalist. You know, try to tell the story, and make the data support it, as opposed to here's a model or here's a graph or here's my Python notebook. Something.
Yeah, I mean, certainly
something
you're
more
looking-
accessible will always work.
Right, you should be looking for narrative coherence,
Yeah.
that's for sure, but we're all in the business of testing, advancing and testing hypotheses.
Yeah.
And looking for the strongest evidence we can. A journalist who's just cherry picking data in order to advance a story, a preconceived story, is a corrupt journalist. So,
Yep.
Yeah, how about over here? Oh, who's got the mic? Oh, thank you.
My question is about perhaps there's, speaking as a layman in both climate science and quantum mechanics, say, is there an inherent hierarchy in the nature of data which prevents some group of people from believing the data? Like, for example, in climate science, we have a dichotomy of people who believe that the science is real and the data is valid, and there is actually human created climate change events going on. But there's another group of people that just disbelieves the data. On the other hand, you have like quantum mechanics things which are equally inaccessible to laypersons, but nobody disbelieves that there's a Higgs boson, for example, that was discovered recently. So could you explain that and maybe give your strategies to counter?
So the question is, why is certain data disbelieved and other data is accepted?
That's right, yeah.
My thought, like I studied physics. I know a thing or two about a Higgs boson. But,
Do you believe it?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it doesn't matter whether I believe it or not, right? It doesn't change my life in any way, except at the global cosmic scale, and if the universe is going to collapse in 10 billion years or 20 billion years, something like that. Whereas I think, what you're saying about climate change and global warming, like these are things like people are putting policies in place. There's belief or not belief. Taxes are being put on people. Gas costs more. So I think it's because the data, whether it's data driven or not, the science is what it is. But because it affects your daily life,
Yeah, I think
you want an outcome that's favorable for you in your personal life.
I think we find increasingly that cognition is driven by values and preconceptions, and that's what's so frustrating. You confront people with clearly, with facts, and they disregard or place insufficient weight on them, and it doesn't change their underlying. There's a lot of psychologists are spending a lot of time assembling depressing evidence of the fact that you can't persuade people with facts. So.
Can we end on a different note?
Yeah, right. How about one more question? Yes. Here. Oh, sorry. Or two more questions.
Hi, thank you. With humans being such visual animals and we're used to believing what we see, can you talk a little bit about deepfake videos and what journalism is doing to help us contain and debunk what's going to come maybe even in the next election cycle?
So there's work that's being done right now to develop, especially on visual journalism, for instance, algorithms and techniques to kind of determine what the reality of the particular image or picture. I can't say how sophisticated that is or how widely developed and explored that is, but it's a known issue in the field. I don't think we've grappled with it fully, but it's something that there are certain experts right now whose job it is.
There's some folks at Stanford at the Brown Institute who are working on that.
Yeah.
Another thing that's happening in kind of alongside the idea of developing and identifying, this is a deep fake and this is not, is just simply the ones that are not, that there's some type of metadata associated with it that you can quickly see. Here's the provenance of this video. Here's the provenance of this information. And so that gives you a level of confidence right there, because
I think a lot of us are afraid not that people will believe the wrong things, that people stop believing anything.
Right. Yeah.
There'll be such a deep-rooted cynicism about information flows that you'll have a very different polity. All right, how about one more question?
Oh, right.
Did you?
Just a question on.
Just fight it out. It'll be all right.
This is going to be real brief. We're going to go to this.
Yeah. So,
one here as well. So,
yeah, just a quick question is, journalism based on the sources, you protect your sources. We are dealing with data sources or data science, right? So how are you going to protect the data sources? Like I hear about CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act, which is called as the mini GPDR. As a journalist, going to conform to that, or or it is just a pipe dream kind of thing?
So your question is, how do we protect the?
Yeah, protect the data sources. The data, there will be some data that will have people behind it. So
Yeah.
just like you protect your sources, you got to protect the people behind the data.
Correct. I mean, I think we use the same techniques that we use for protecting our sources. I mean, there is freedom of the press, thank goodness. So we are largely free of a lot of the regulatory schemes that exist to do data protection in other areas. And journalists traditionally have been given that latitude to protect your sources. Now, as Ed points out, there's been an unrestrained assault on that practice in the past 10 or 15 years. But I think in general, the practices you take to protect a source would be the same to protect a data source.
There's also a lot of talk about using just old school tradecraft techniques like and source education, like educating sources that, hey, the best way to get in touch with a journalist sometimes is not through any electronic means, and it still works. I mean, a lot of people have very successfully leaked information just through old school mailing things.
A USB stick, love it, thank you.
Yeah. Or meeting them in person or something to that effect, and just because there's an electronic trail left everywhere you go with every email you send and every message you send.
And I've used, there's been encryption on emails with some sources. I've used burner phones. I've used give me the envelope at the corner kind of thing. So there's all kinds of ways to try to make sure you're protecting that information. Or if somebody's giving you a data set, that you're then holding it close in a way that other people won't be getting access to it.
Let's take one final question. Great t-shirt. Yeah, go to Mike. Yeah.
I had a question, or if you could say more about the ethics of allowing rebuttals of data journalism. So it's not quite the same as saying, here's a story, and you're going to write something about somebody, and you call them for comment, before you publish. And I'm thinking back to a couple of years ago, ProPublica did the story on recidivism prediction and sort of bias in machine learning.
Right.
And really solid data and statistical analysis in that, but there were also really solid rebuttals that came after the fact. Is there an opportunity to sort of look for a rebuttal or an alternate interpretation before publishing? Right? Because these things are very slow, right? They take a lot of time. I'm curious how you think about that when it's not just about the 100,000 doctors who will be named,
right,
but hey, here's one way of looking at the data, but somebody else may have a different perspective.
Right, so we do have that more codified precisely because of that. He's describing a story which we ran, which looked at algorithmically, kind of a forensic algorithm examination of sentencing, of how judges sentence using a predictive model. And we found that it sentenced unfairly against minorities. But there were several very well done studies afterwards.
One by a colleague of mine who I work with a lot.
Which sort of analyzed that and said, well, is this 100% the way that is? So one of our responses is we do have an internal, it's not as formal as a peer review process, but we do have where we go and kind of go to other statisticians and other reporters, and we kind of what's called red team the story. You sort of like bring all your fire to say, this is why we think this is wrong. Is that a perfect system? No. But I actually prefer the public exchange of analyses and charges back and forth much more than I appreciate the kind of the completely internal and hidden peer review process. We're peer reviewed publicly. We publish the story, and now you say this is wrong, and you say this is wrong, and then we, as a news organization, will cover that. I mean, that's our responsibility. So I actually kind of admire the transparency of that fight and that analysis, and we welcome it. And so that's what our.
I actually have 2 points to this. And one is that when I do a really complex analysis, I do the same thing that ProPublica does. I've done it at almost any newsroom I've ever worked at, where you go find experts in the field and run your analysis. by that person. And then you also, if there's somebody who you want to get comment from, you might say, here are the parameters of my analysis. This is what I did. And then how can you comment to those points? If you have issues with any of those points, then I might fact check it again and figure it out. To the point of just hiring like just statisticians out there, I think that it depends on the story, because some of these things are very narrow fields. And I think you have to find the right expert to be able to really have somebody weigh in with real credibility on some specific stories. So I think that there needs to be more done in that kind of realm, I think, as well.
Shall we wind up? Yes? Well, we
Sorry.
don't want to overstay our welcome. Amit, Jeremy, Cheryl, T, thank you. Thank you all for being here.